Welcome, I'm Judy Jordan, and today we are going to talk about Greg Orr's essay, Four Temperaments and the Forms of Poetry. In this essay, Greg Orr posits that we as poets have a temperament. Another way of putting that is an aesthetic, or something we're drawn to in poetry, and something we seem to gravitate towards when we're writing poetry. And according to Greg, the four temperaments are story, form structure, music, and imagination. And the thing that I learned most about this particular theory is that one must strive to have a balance of these aesthetics. So for example, I first heard about this essay from Greg Orr himself when he was my professor at the University of Virginia, where I was an MFA student. And according to Greg, and he was right, I had a very strong temperament, a very strong aesthetic toward poetry. But my poems were suffering from that because I was not drawing from other temperaments such as music or imagination. And so I worked very hard to add music, and by music I mean assonance, alliteration, syntactical twist in language, and a loose meter. And imagination such as similes, or metaphors, or great leaps. But I've always had a strong story, and that's always what's been very important to me in poetry. And this is something that I do not want to lose. And according to Greg, one should not lose one's strength. One, in fact, should continue to strive toward being even stronger in what you were already good at, which in my case was story. In your case, it might be story, it might be music, it might be imagination, it might be form structure. It is whatever you love, whatever is your aesthetic, whatever you're drawn toward. But according to Greg, the story and form and structure are limited, and the music and imagination are limitless. And so what you want to do is balance your poem so that you have on one side either story or form and structure, and on the other side either music or imagination. Now what I'm going to do in this short series of lectures is break down and give example poems of each: story, structure, form, music, imagination, and poems which draw them all together and are nicely balanced. I'm going to also link to Greg Orr's essay so you can read it yourself. Okay? So the first poem that I would like to talk about is a poem called Oranges by Gary Soto. And you'll notice in this poem that it is very much a traditional story, like you would see if you watched a movie or read a novel or a short story or even a commercial. If a friend of yours told you a story after going out on a date one night. It has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end, it has a conflict, and it has a resolution. And these are important in poems. They hold the interest of the reader. Okay, I'm going to read the poem Oranges by Gary Soto. The first time I walked with a girl, I was 12, cold and weighted down with 2 oranges in my jacket. December. Frost cracking beneath my steps, my breath before me, then gone as I walked toward her house, the one whose porch light burned yellow night and day in any weather. A dog barked at me until she came out, pulling at her gloves, face bright with rouge. I smiled, touched her shoulder, and led her down the street, across a used car lot and a line of newly planted trees, until we were breathing before a drugstore. We entered, the tiny bell bringing a sales lady down a narrow aisle of goods. I turned to the candies, tiered like bleachers, and asked what she wanted. Light in her eyes, a smile starting at the corners of her mouth, I fingered a nickel in my pocket, and when she lifted a chocolate that cost a dime, I didn't say anything. I took the nickel from my pocket, then an orange, and set them on quietly on the counter. When I looked up, the lady's eyes met mine and held them, knowing very well what it was all about. Outside, a few cars hissing past, fog hanging like old coats between the trees. I took my girl's hands in mine for 2 blocks, then released it to let her unwrap the chocolate. I peeled my orange that was so bright against the gray of December that from a distance someone might have thought I was making a fire in my hands. You see just what a beautiful poem this is. It has a very obvious conflict. it leads you to question immediately the first time I walked with a girl. And immediately the reader says, what's going to happen? This is his first date. He's 12 years old. He has nothing but 2 oranges, and he's going to pick up this girl that he likes. And immediately you have questions, and the poem takes you through. Every time you have a question, the poem answers the question. And it takes you through to this very obvious beginning and this beautiful middle where they're at the store and she's picking up a dime chocolate. And then you have this very strong conflict. And the conflict, is a less obvious conflict that's not directly mentioned is, of course, poverty. But the conflict of what's going to happen on this date when all he has is a nickel and 2 oranges. And the girl he wants to impress, who he wants to like him, chooses a chocolate that costs a dime. And then you have this wonderful moment, this quiet moment where the orange and the nickel are sitting on the counter and the 2 are looking at each other, and it's just as if it's a film being made, which I think is what makes a really great poem. You should be able to see the poem. Basically, it's images. I have almost got this poem memorized because of images. If it were abstractions, it would go in one ear and out the other ear, and I would not remember it from 1 minute to the next. But images I remember. I remember the dog barking. I remember the porch light burning yellow. I remember the girl's face bright with the rouge. I remember the fog hanging between the trees like old coats. I can see it as if I'm watching a film, the nickel and the orange on the counter, and the little boy who's 12 years old, and the woman who works there, catching his eye and knowing good and well what it's all about. And at the end, I can see him sitting there in this gray wash of December behind his back, and he's peeling the orange, and it looks as if he's built a fire in his hands. And it's just this beautiful final image of which I could interpret if I wanted to, but I don't have to. As a writer, it's not my job to write things that to be analyzed. It's my job to write a beautiful story that will interest someone, that someone will want to read and read again. Now, as a professor at a university, sometimes I do analyze poems. And I can look at this poem and I can say this poem works on a very surface basis. It's a very clear story, but it also has things going on in the background. For example, if you thought about it, you would think this poem was an abstract painting. If you did it, as I said, if you filmed it, and you filmed it as light, you would see the porch light burning yellow. You would see her face bright with rouge. And at the end, you would see this bright orange fire. And it would be against this great backdrop of gray. So it would be like an abstract painting. But the other things I notice as a writer, is that this very strong story, and Gary Soto is very much a poet of story. But there's also moments of music, moments of imagination, which I think makes this poem work. For example, he uses alliteration when he says, frost cracking beneath my steps, my breath before me, then gone. You have those hard B sounds, and it's almost like the frost itself is cracking because you have those hard B sounds. And then you have that beautiful moment in the store when he's fingering a nickel in his pocket. And she lifts a chocolate that cost a dime. And he doesn't say anything. You have those short I sounds, fingered, nickel, lifted, anything, that just echo down through the poem. And then you have the wonderful leaps of imagination when he says, fog hanging like old coats between the trees. And he says, the cars hissing past, but they become snake-like. And then he has the candies tiered like bleachers. So you can see it just as if you're making a film, which I think is what people look for in a poem. They want to be able to see it as if they were watching a movie. They want to be able to understand it. And then if they read it again, which I think they will if it's a beautiful poem like Gary Soto's Oranges, then they'll see the other things, like the fact that it's like an abstract painting, and they'll notice the assonance and alliteration, and then they'll notice that beautiful image at the end. They'll notice, that he's peeling the orange, and it's like he's building his entire life right there. It's like this fire. Fire represents life. Fire represents future. Fire represents the warmth and how you cook your food and you survive with fire. It's a survival, and he's going to survive. There's this 12-year-old boy who lives in poverty, and he's going to survive, and he knows it at this point. And he knows it because of this woman who knew very well what it was all about, and didn't say a word, but took the orange and took the nickel and gave him a chocolate that cost a dime in exchange for it. And that's a moment of resolution in the poem. Just as if it was in a short story, you would have a beginning, a middle, an end, and a resolution, and you have this beautiful resolution. You have this moment, hanging moment of conflict that just becomes this beautiful moment of resolution. It's a beautiful poem that works very much on story, but then also has something from the other side of the graph, the similes and the assonance and alliteration. But Gary Soto is very much a story-based poet. The poem works without a lot of assonance alliteration, without a lot of similes, without a lot of imagination, without a lot of music and alliteration, because it's a strong story. It's a story with a very obvious conflict and very interesting, and also because he has made a movie for you. He has shown you this world. He is world built. He's shown you this world in which he lives, which the frost is cracking beneath his steps, and the breath is before him and gone, and the trees that are newly planted, and the fog hanging between those trees that are newly planted like old coats, and the used car lot. He showed you the world in which he lives, and we're interested in that world because we can see it, we remember it, and we love it. I just want to add one thing here at the end, and this is mostly for the high school students who might wander over here. I often, when I Google the poem Oranges, will find in certain like Reddit or Quora someone desperately asking, what do the oranges in Gary Soto's poem Oranges represent? And I'm fairly certain they're high school students who have been instructed to go home and write a paper. I just want to say that the oranges can represent something if you want them to. And please feel free to put in the comments what you think the oranges represent, or if you think I'm completely wrong in what I think they represent. Now, when I first read this poem, I did not think to myself, what do those oranges represent? In fact, I never thought to myself, what do those oranges represent, until I Googled the poem and found other people asking the question. But the oranges are real. It's important to remember that. As writers, we write real, okay? But as Robert Frost says, symbolism flies off everything. Many of you probably know that cartoon in which an English teacher is talking on and on and on and on about what the blue curtains in the also famous novelist novel represent. And they represent depression and how sad he felt, and on and on and on. And then the author comes in and says, the curtains were blue. Okay, as writers, we make the curtains blue. Now, I am going to put a craft lecture on here about in times and when indeed we do choose certain images in order to talk about something deeper. But on the surface, a poem, a novel, a short story, on the surface must work as content, as a story, as Alden says, the peg to hang your music on. But if you want to interpret it, you can. I did not think to myself when I first read the poem, what does that final image of him unpilling the orange against the backdrop of the gray sky represent? I did not think that. What I thought was, wow, what a gorgeous image. Wow, what a gorgeous simile. And that is what I look for when I read poems. And if I find that in a poem, I will love the poem enough to read it again and again and again and again. And I will love it enough to teach it in my classes. And then, as I'm reading it again and again, I will start thinking about things like, what does this represent? Okay? But remember, the oranges are real. Gary Soto grew up in Southern California. I lived in Southern California for 1 year, and the one thing I learned there was when I walked my dog, my pug dog Beauregard, I could just pick oranges off the trees. Oranges, lemons, grapefruit, avocados, fruit grows on the trees, and if you're walking along the road, you can just pick it up. And I suspect that is exactly what Gary Soto did, that as a child he was walking along and he picked 2 oranges off the trees, and they are very real oranges, which later he will eat. They are real, just like the dog barking is real, just like the porch light that burns yellow night and day is real, just like the rouge on the girl's cheek is real, just like the fog that is hanging between the trees like old coats is real. They are real, just like the poverty which puts him in a neighborhood where there's a used car lot which he walks through. A used car lot, not a new car lot, because in this neighborhood no one can afford new cars. They are real, just like the fog looking like old coats, because Gary Soto has probably never seen a new coat. They are real. They are real, just like I don't have any oranges growing in my yard, but I have a fig bush, and I just went out and picked 3 figs, and I also picked an Osage orange, which unfortunately is not edible, but these are real. I will eat these later. This I will find something else to do with. They are real. Okay, now you have to write a paper for your English teacher. So let me suggest something. If the fire at the end represents warmth and survival, and I think it does. Now, if you disagree, you're welcome to put it in the comments, or if you agree, you can put it in the comments. Or if you think it represents more than that, you can add that. I will read it, and I will enjoy it, and I may even teach it in my classes. But I think that fire represents the ability to cook food, the ability to stay warm, the ability to survive, the ability to thrive even. And the orange at the end would also represent survival. It would represent nutrition, something you can eat, something that you can live with. I think the oranges then can be said to represent the fact that Gary Soto is going to thrive. He's not only going to survive, but he's going to thrive, and he's going to move on in his life, and it's going to be a beautiful life. I say this because imagine, if you will, that the moment when he puts the nickel and the orange on the counter, and the lady's eyes catches his, and it's all silent, and she doesn't say a word, and she knows exactly what it's all about. Imagine, if you will, if that moment had gone differently. If the lady had refused to take the orange and nickel in trade for the dime chocolate, but instead had said, "You need more money." And Gary Soto had no more money, and he would have been embarrassed in front of the world he was trying to impress on his first date, and it would have represented a failure on his very first date, and an inability to use his own wit to survive. I think the oranges represent the world opening up for Gary Soto, him unpeeling the orange, so the orange could be the world. He unpeels it, it's there for him, it's opening up, and life is going to be wonderful. Now, that's just one interpretation. There are no doubt many others. That's just what I think when I read it. But first, when I read it, I don't think any of that. I think, what a beautiful poem. What a wonderful poem that I want to read again and again and again. Thank you for listening. Please feel free to put in comments what you think, and anything else you'd like to put in the comments. Give me a like, and if you want to subscribe, that would be great, because there's going to be a lot more craft lectures coming, and there's going to be videos, and there's going to be book reviews, and it's all going to be wonderful, I hope. Thank you.